If the $8 million are not paid, the hands will never return. In June 1987, this message was found in the tomb of one of Argentina's most important presidents. An unknown group had bypassed 12 security locks and a 170 kilograms bulletproof glass, not to steal jewelry or money, but to take the hands of Juan Domingo Perón. And that was just the beginning of one of the strangest mysteries in the country's history, the disappearance of Sofía Herrera. Sunday, the 28th of September 2008, began as a day of rest and togetherness for the Herrera family in the extreme south of Argentina, but it sadly ended up becoming one of the most painful mysteries of Tierra del Fuego. Maria Elena Delgado, who was pregnant at the time, and her husband Fabián Herrera, left their home in Rio Grande to enjoy a day in the countryside along with their little daughter, just 3 years and 8 months old, Sofía Yasmin Herrera. Before reaching their destination, they stopped at the La Anónima supermarket to buy meat and stopped at a gas station to get water for mate. At that place, they took a family photo and met their friends Noemi Ramirez and Silvio Jimenez, who were traveling with their children and Noemi's younger brother, a boy of only 6 years old. Around 11 inches the morning, the two families arrived at the John Goodall camping site, a location situated next to National Route 3, about 60 kilometers from Rio Grande. After paying the 15 peso entrance fee to the site's caretaker, Alberto Urrutia, they parked their vehicles near a wire fence adjacent to the road. It was the ideal setting for a barbecue. The weather was pleasant, the terrain was mostly flat, and there were no other people in the area. While the women stayed in the cars, Fabián, Silvio, and the children, including Sofía, went into the grounds to look for firewood and the exact spot to set up. Barely 9 minutes after arriving at the site, the tranquility turned into horror and then panic. The men decided to return to the vehicles upon not finding a suitable spot, but upon arrival, they noticed that Sofía was not with them. Fabián thought his daughter had simply turned around to go back to her mother, but Maria Elena never saw her return. Desperation took hold of them and they immediately began calling her name and searching every corner of the campsite, even checking the caretaker's small house. But the girl seemed to have vanished into thin air. At around 12 noon, after 40 minutes of fruitless searching, they used the caretaker's radio to alert the police. The response was quite slow. The provincial police took approximately 2 hours to arrive at the campsite, and it was not until 12 midnight, more than 12 hours after the disappearance, that notice was given to the boarders to initiate controls. Since there was no established protocol at the time for the disappearance of minors in the province, the area was not properly preserved, allowing many people to enter the site to help, which may have destroyed vital evidence on the ground. During the next 7 days, an unprecedented search operation was carried out that included helicopters, divers, patrols, and tracking dogs from various provinces. Fabián Herrera remained at the campsite for that entire week, sleeping there with the hope of finding his daughter. The most disconcerting piece of information was provided by the search dogs, as almost all of them followed a trail that headed toward the fence of the property that bordered Route 3. And once it crossed onto the asphalt, little Sofía's trail was lost completely on the road, suggesting that someone could have pulled her into a vehicle. In August 2009, nearly a year after the disappearance, the campsite caretaker, Alberto Urrutia, was detained under suspicion of having participated in the abduction of the minor, although he was finally released months later as no evidence was found against him. Even Sofía's father, Fabián Herrera, spent 2 days in prison accused of hindering the investigation due to supposed contradictions regarding the place and exact time of the disappearance during the reconstruction of events. In June 2009, just as Father's Day was being celebrated, the Herrera house phone began to ring. Upon answering, Fabián heard a young boy's voice on the other end of the line simply say, "Hello, Dad." Immediately afterward, a man took control of the communication and claimed to have Sofía kidnapped. The demand was clear. He asked for $50,000 in exchange for returning the girl alive. This contact generated an immediate mobilization of the authorities, and the anti-kidnapping police instructed Maria Elena and Fabián to negotiate with the captor, trying to gain time and obtain proof of life. However, the investigators discovered that it was not a real kidnapping, but a setup orchestrated by a 30-year-old man living in the province of San Luis. This son of a expletive, and I apologize, because I don't usually express myself like that in these videos, but I have no other words to describe it, driven solely by the ambition of collecting $1 million reward. had planned an extortion without caring about the damage he was causing. The most shocking thing was discovering that the child's voice that Fabian had heard at the beginning of the call was not that of his daughter, but that of the man's own son, a boy of just 2 years old whom his father forced to participate in this deception. And that wasn't even the worst thing that happened to this family after their daughter's disappearance. For some time later, a supposed psychic, named Veronica Contreras, took it upon herself to initiate media harassment towards Sofia's parents. This woman began a campaign against them, claiming that they had beaten her to death and buried her in their own backyard. The situation reached such an extreme that the family had to request police protection, and to end those baseless suspicions, Sofia's parents allowed their garden to be excavated in front of television cameras in 2017. As expected, absolutely nothing was found, and sometime later, the psychic was declared unaccountable due to suffering from psychiatric disorders. The hope of finding Sofía alive flickered on and off, with every report of a girl resembling her in some corner of the country or abroad. There were 2 cases that were on the verge of closing the investigation. The first occurred in a private neighborhood in Buenos Aires, where a couple of doctors had an adopted daughter with an amazing resemblance to Sofía. The prosecutor of the case actually traveled to observe the girl from a distance in a park, but upon seeing the photos up close, Maria Elena confirmed it was not her daughter. The second case occurred in Mendoza in 2012, where it was reported that a girl who was homeschooled was identical to the missing little girl. Her parents said she was an enlightened child with the stigmata of Christ. Maria Elena traveled personally and went into shock due to the physical resemblance she had to her daughter, but subsequently, fingerprint analysis definitively ruled out that it could be Sofía. There was a key testimony in this case, a fundamental clue that had not been taken into account. Nestor, the 6-year-old boy who was at the campsite that day, had given a very specific version from the beginning. He recounted that he saw an ugly man, in his own words, taking Sofía away in a gray car, even describing that the subject was accompanied by a boxer dog. At that time, psychologists dismissed his account, thinking the boy was just seeking attention, but years later, that description took on great importance. In September 2020, the justice system of Tierra del Fuego ordered the international capture of a man with a very strange nickname, Espanta la Virgen, the Virgin Scarer. His real name is José Dagoberto Díaz Aguila, a laborer of Chilean nationality who lived and worked in Rio Grande for some years. This man became the main suspect thanks to the union of 2 testimonies. On one hand, that of Nestor, and on the other, that of a police non-commissioned officer who remembered having spoken with him during the first days of the search, an occasion in which the subject claimed to know what had happened to the girl. Nestor, now an adult, testified again, and his description of the man who took Sofía matched 75% with the image of Díaz Aguila that appeared in police records. Díaz Aguila is described as a nomad, a man who perfectly knows the fields, and who is capable of crossing the border between Chile and Argentina, on foot through unpopulated paths. His dangerousness became clear at the end of 2016, when he was accused of attempting to kill a neighbor by stabbing him in a boarding house in Rio Grande. Since that attack, the suspect has disappeared completely from official radars, becoming a ghost that Interpol has been trying to track with a red notice ever since. Investigators maintain the hypothesis that this man could have captured Sofía at the foot of the fence and that he possibly ended her life to cover up the kidnapping. To this day, the whereabouts of this individual have not been found. This case changed forever the way Argentina searches for its missing children. In her honor, the Sofía Alert was created, a national emergency system that is activated immediately to coordinate the search for minors. Sofía Herrera would be 19 years old today. Her mother, Maria Elena, continues to disseminate updated images of how her face would look today, with the hope that someone somewhere will recognize her gaze and perhaps one day be able to see her daughter alive again. The theft of Perón's hands. At the end of June 1987, several important figures in Argentine politics began receiving strange letters, which contained messages written with spelling errors, references difficult to understand, and an even stranger signature, Hermes III, and the trees. At first, no one knew what to think. Some believed it was some kind of sick joke, while others thought it was some type of political threat, something quite delicate considering the climate the country was going through at those moments. The democracy had only been back in the country for a few years after going through an intense military dictatorship, so the government of Raúl Alfonsín was facing enormous social tension and the fear of new political conflicts was very present. Perhaps that is why the tension reached an extreme high when it was known that, according to these letters, an unknown group had entered the tomb of Juan Domingo Perón, one of the most important presidents in Argentine history and founder of the Peronist movement, to take his corpse and steal his hands. To prove they were telling the truth, they included fragments of a poem that had remained inside the coffin since Perón's funeral in 1974. But not only that, as the authors of the letters demanded $8 million in exchange for returning the hands and other objects supposedly stolen from the coffin. At first, all of this sounded absurd, almost surreal, until a few days later, they discovered it was no joke. It was real. On the 29th of June 1987, Roberto Garcia, Perón's nephew-in-law, went to visit the family vault located in the La Chacarita cemetery in Buenos Aires and noticed that something was not right. There were broken glasses, signs of intrusion, and some objects had disappeared. The report quickly reached Judge Jaime Farswao, who decided to personally inspect the place along with forensic doctors and specialists from the federal police. What they found inside turned this case into one of the most disturbing mysteries in the country's modern history. The bulletproof glass protecting the coffin was pierced, and the metal cover of the coffin had been opened. When they finally observed Perón's embalmed body, they discovered that, just as the letters stated, both hands had been amputated. According to the experts, the cuts seemed recent and had probably been performed using specialized surgical tools. Inside the coffin, they also found candle remnants and a small rubber finger protector, possibly used during the procedure. And the more they analyzed the scene, the stranger it became, because, for example, the bulletproof glass, which weighed nearly 170 kilograms, required 12 different keys to be opened correctly, so carrying out a procedure to force or break it would have taken several hours. However, no one heard anything, no one noticed suspicious movements, and absolutely nothing out of the ordinary was reported. As days passed, some investigators began to suspect that those who desecrated the tomb did have access to the original keys to the vault, and that the glass had been broken afterward only to divert the investigation, which, if true, meant something much worse. Whoever had carried out the desecration could have counted on internal help. Meanwhile, the theories began to multiply. There was talk of political operations, destined to create chaos and take advantage of the country's delicate moment. Others pointed toward former intelligence agents who could be related to the military dictatorship. Hypotheses also emerged involving esoteric rituals, Freemasonry, and the Italian lodge propaganda due to the strange signature of Hermes III and the 13, and the connections that some people close to Perón had with occult topics. And of course, there was no lack of economic theories. For years, the rumor circulated that Perón's hands were necessary to access a supposed secret account that was in Switzerland, or even open a biometric safe protected by hand recognition. Although to many, this idea sounded absurd, it is undeniable that it helped fuel the mystery even more. Although what probably completely cemented the idea that there was something truly strange about this case was when some people related to the story began to die. The first was Luis Paulino Lavagna, one of the cemetery watchmen in Chacarita, who had commented several times that he feared they would kill him. Although initially it was said that he had died of natural causes, a later autopsy revealed that he had actually been beaten to death. Shortly after, Maria del Carmen Melo died, a woman who frequently brought flowers to Perón's tomb, and who shortly before had claimed to be able to identify one of the suspects seen near the vault. Months later, something even stranger occurred. Judge Jaime Farswao died along with his wife in a supposed car accident on Route 3 near Coronel Dorrego. The vehicle overturned inexplicably on a straight stretch of the highway, and some people related to the investigation suspected for many years that this had actually been an attack. After his death, a mysterious black folder also disappeared where Farswao kept important documents related to this case. Later, the head of the federal police, Juan Angel Pirker, who also knew important details of the investigation, died officially from an asthma attack inside his office. Shortly after, Commissioner Carlos Zunino, in charge of the police investigation, survived by a miracle after receiving a gunshot to the head during an alleged robbery attempt. In 1994, a set of cemetery keys appeared inside the police station linked to the case, further reinforcing the suspicion that behind everything there was the participation of people related to security forces or intelligence services. Later, another judge investigating the case reported that a commando group broke into his house and stole exclusively documents related to the file. ignoring valuables and money that were completely in plain sight. With the passage of years, the case has sunk deeper and deeper among incomplete files and theories that cannot be confirmed. And today, more than 35 years later, the whereabouts of Perón's hands remain unknown. There are no convicted persons, no confessions, and there is no real explanation of how a group of people could enter one of the most symbolic and protected tombs in the country, desecrate the body of the former president, and then disappear completely. The disappearance of the TC-48. In the spring of 1965, 68 people boarded a large plane in Argentina with the dream of fulfilling a goal. It was the 31st graduating class of the Military Aviation School, a group of young cadets who were about to graduate and were undertaking their final instruction trip to the United States. The group left divided into two Douglas DC-4 planes. These two planes were the T-43 and the TC-48. Before leaving, the atmosphere was one of joy and celebration. Even President Arturo Illia came to see them off personally. However, there were technical details that should not have been overlooked, details that, had they been addressed, would have changed the course of history. The mechanical non-commissioned officer Basilio Rochin, in charge of the aircraft maintenance, warned insistently that the TC-48 was not in optimal condition to perform a voyage of that magnitude. Both planes had to travel approximately 7,000 kilometers to their destination. Despite that very clear warning, the response he received from his superiors was simply that the trip had to be made. Rochin was supposed to travel on the TC-48, so, very much against his will, he said goodbye to his family in tears, sensing that something terrible could happen. On October 31, both planes took off, and from the first segments, the problems became evident. While the T-43 could fly at high altitude thanks to its pressurization system, the TC-48 lacked it, which forced its crew to cross the Andes mountain range through a lower area to avoid lack of oxygen. During the stopovers in Chile and Peru, the strange noises from engines 3 and 4, located on the right wing, forced the mechanics to perform emergency checks that delayed the itinerary. Later investigations would reveal that these planes had a factory design flaw in the fuel pipes, which were made of plastic and tended to break, causing fires. Although the TC-48 was a veteran of demanding missions like those in Antarctica, its maintenance had not been ideal, and it was already scheduled for a visit to the workshops for the beginning of the following year. At dawn on the 3rd of November 1965, the two aircraft took off from the Howard Air Base in Panama with barely 6 minutes of difference. The destination was San Salvador, a route of 150 kilometers over the Caribbean Sea. The weather was hostile, with intense rain, strong turbulence, and visibility almost zero. A few minutes into the flight, the radio operator of the TC-48 sent a desperate message reporting that engine number 3 was engulfed in flames and that engine number 4 had stopped. They were flying with only one operational wing in the middle of a fierce storm. Alvaro Proti, a pilot of a commercial plane who was passing through the area, heard the emergency and advised them to divert toward the Puerto Limón runway in Costa Rica, as it was the closest and safest place for a forced landing. At 7:05 inches the morning, the last radio contact of the TC-48 was registered. The crew reported that they were flying over the Bocas del Toro area and that they were trying to head toward Puerto Limón. At that moment, the plane was flying at a dangerously low altitude and struggling to stay in the air with a heavy load of passengers and fuel. After that message, the radio went silent. Meanwhile, the companion plane, the T-43, continued its route to El Salvador without diverting to assist its companions. Upon landing, the gravity of the situation was initially hidden from the cadets of the first plane. While in Argentina, the families were already beginning to receive confusing calls that only spoke of a loss of contact. The mystery of the cadets' plane was only being born. After the last radio contact, the official search was activated quickly, but ended abruptly. The Argentine Air Force, backed by U.S. reports, maintained almost immediately that the plane had plummeted into the Caribbean Sea and that its occupants had been devoured by sharks, using exactly those words. To support this version, they presented supposed evidence found in the water, such as life jackets, boats, and some caps. However, the families quickly noticed that something was wrong. With that explanation, the supposed items recovered did not match the plane's standard equipment. They had different colors than the originals, and the most suspicious thing of all was that they emitted a strong smell of mothballs, as if they had been taken out of a storage room and not from the ocean. The authorities also claimed to have recovered from the sea the identity card of one of the cadets named Oscar Bautista, and initially refused to hand it over, alleging that it was deteriorated by shark bites. But when the family finally could see the document, it was intact. Years later, an expert report carried out by the National Gendarmerie confirmed something quite disturbing. That document had never been in contact with saltwater. It turned out that the cadet, for fear of losing his belongings, had given the document to a companion on the other plane before takeoff. These manipulations sowed very deep distrust and led the parents to reject the official condolences, convinced that the state was hiding the truth from them. While the official version crumbled, in the thick jungle of Costa Rica, testimonies began to sprout from residents of the Talamanca area and the Rio Estrella Valley, who claimed to have seen a gray, four-engine plane flying at a very low altitude, losing itself among the clouds and the mountains. Perhaps the most shocking testimony was that of an indigenous boy named Rafael, who, before dying in a local hospital due to peritonitis, recounted having seen deep in the jungle many people, the same, with short hair, describing an improvised camp 1 or 2 days of walking from a ranch he knew. Despite these clues, the Argentine government of that time was hostile toward any attempt at a land search, even going so far as to pressure the Costa Rican authorities to withhold the passports of the relatives who intended to venture into the jungle on their own. The behavior of the crew of the other plane, the T-43, also left quite a few doubts. Although its crew heard the emergency, it continued its route to El Salvador without diverting, arguing that it was not mandatory to return in such cases. Decades later, a radio operator from that same flight revealed that after receiving the TC-48's distress call, his superiors ordered him to shut up and keep going as if nothing had happened. And as if this case didn't have enough conspiratorial aura, the official files ended up getting lost in 1980 during a collapse in a wing of the Condor building, something that many have questioned, and with good reason. The search initiated by the cadets' parents over time was inherited by their children and grandchildren, who refused to let this case be forgotten. Among them stands out Cecilia Viberti, daughter of the second pilot, who undertook multiple expeditions to the Costa Rican jungle, paying for each attempt with her own resources. In those journeys, she had the support of Wilfredo Rojas, a Costa Rican geologist who dedicated more than 20 years of his life and 28 expeditions to searching for the lost plane selflessly, moved only by the curiosity of a story his teacher told him when he was a child. The Talamanca jungle, however, is an inhospitable terrain where the vegetation is so dense that one could be a few meters from the wreckage of the plane without being able to see it, and where advancing just a few kilometers can require quite a few hours of effort with machete in hand. This mystery fueled a series of myths and legends like that of the Indio Porfiador, the stubborn Indian, a man who supposedly had found the wreckage of the plane and murdered 3 survivors to rob them. Although after being detained, no evidence or belongings of the cadets were found in his possession. The rumor also circulated that the plane was transporting wooden boxes full of gold or explosives, based on a finding that was never confirmed of burned crates in the jungle. Meanwhile, the Argentine Air Force reopened the case between 2008 and 2015 through operations called Esperanza, Hope. These missions used side-scan sonars in the sea and specialized land patrols. But again, the wreckage was not found. 60 years have passed since that tragic dawn, and the TC-48 remains until now the greatest enigma in the history of Argentine aviation. Hello. We are taking a small break to remind you that if you are enjoying this content, we also have much more on other channels like Historias de Mundo Creepy, where we tell the most chilling stories lived by our audience, and in Creepypastas del Mundo Creepy, we narrate terrifying stories written by us. All this available on YouTube or also on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you very much, and we continue with the content. The disappearance of Loan Peña. Those who know the channel Más Tiempo will know that we usually avoid talking about cases that are too recent, especially when they involve minors, since they are stories that are still open, where there are families still waiting for an answer. However, the case of Loan Peña has become something so big and so disturbing that we felt it was important to include it. Although, of course, always with the due respect and caution it deserves. On the 13th of June 2024, in a small rural area known as El Algarrobal in the province of Corrientes, Loan Danilo Peña, 5 years old, arrived with his father at his grandmother's house to participate in a family lunch. After eating, several adults and some children decided to walk toward an orange grove located approximately 500 meters from the house. Among them were Loan, his uncle Antonio Benitez, a friend couple named Daniel Ramirez and Monica Malapi, in addition to other minors. At 1:52 inches the afternoon, a photograph was taken that would later become one of the most well-known images of this case. In it, you can see Loan walking toward the orange grove, along with the rest of the group. This was the last time anyone was able to photograph him. According to later statements, once they reached the spot, the children began to play while the adults remained close. Some witnesses said they had seen Loan running, others claimed he was with the adults, and some others ensured that from one moment to the next, they simply stopped seeing him. The strange thing is that no one could explain exactly what the moment was when he disappeared. When they noticed his absence, the relatives began to look for him among the trees, then in the surroundings of the field, and finally, they gave notice to the authorities. In a few hours, the area was filled with police, tracking dogs, drones, and search groups that traversed thousands of hectares of rugged and swampy terrain. At the beginning, the main hypothesis was that Loan had simply gotten lost in the woods. However, almost from the start, there were details that did not quite fit. The boy's own mother came to declare publicly that she believed someone had taken him. The father also said that something didn't add up and questioned why they had taken the child so far without giving notice. Meanwhile, contradictions began to emerge between the people who were in the orange grove along with Loan. A day after the disappearance, one of the boy's shoes appeared in a muddy area several kilometers from the grandmother's house. For a time, that was seen as evidence that the boy had gotten lost in the field. However, as the investigation progressed, the authorities began to suspect something much more disturbing, that the shoe had been placed there deliberately to divert the search. And this was not the only strange twist in this case, because as the forensic examinations advanced, investigators began to focus more and more on the adults present during that lunch. The situation worsened when tracking dogs detected scent trails compatible with Loan inside the Ford Ranger pickup truck belonging to Maria Victoria Cayaba and her husband Carlos Perez, another couple close to the family who had also been at the gathering that day. From that moment, the case stopped being investigated as a simple accidental disappearance, and the justice system began to work under the hypothesis of a possible abduction and concealment of the minor. As the weeks passed, practically all the people who were present during the lunch ended up being detained or placed under investigation. Among them were Antonio Benitez, Daniel Ramirez, Mónica Milapi, Loan Peña, Maria Victoria Cayaba, Carlos Pérez, and even Walter Maciel, the local commissioner initially in charge of coordinating the search for Loan. But while this investigation advanced more, everything also became more confusing. The testimonies began to change constantly. Some suspects modified schedules, versions, and routes. Phone records began to show calls and communications that they could not explain during the hours Loan disappeared. Accusations of evidence tampering and possible cover-up attempts also appeared. One of the strangest moments occurred when Loan Peña, Loan's aunt, declared that the boy had been accidentally run over by Cayaba and Perez, and that they had later hidden the body. However, sometime later, she retracted it herself and denied this version, while authorities assured that there were also indications of her participation in the supposed planting of the shoe found in the mud. After this, the investigation became a huge puzzle full of contradictions, strange movements, suspicious calls, and conflicting versions between people who, until that day, were supposedly close to each other. Over time, even a second group of accused people appeared. Individuals linked to an organization called Fundación du Puyoy, who were investigated for allegedly having manipulated witnesses, altered statements, and hindered the cause while claiming to collaborate with the search. But even after hundreds of sweeps, raids, arrests, and forensic tests, the most important question still has no answer. Where is Loan? In March 2026, nearly 2 years after his disappearance, the prosecutor's office presented an official reconstruction of the case, where it maintains that Loan had been deliberately separated from his father's custody during the family lunch and then hidden, possibly using the Perez-Cayaba couple's truck. Furthermore, the investigation maintains that several of the subsequent tests and movements had been coordinated to divert attention and hinder the search. Even so, the boy's whereabouts remain completely unknown. Currently, there are 17 people accused in different lines of investigation, and this case continues to advance toward the oral trial, while authorities continue to reconstruct what happened that afternoon in the orange grove. By May 2026, the date this video is being made, both judges, prosecutors, and family members returned again to the grandmother's house and the so-called Zone Zero to try to understand how Loan disappeared, without anyone really being able to explain what happened. We hope that one day this case can finally be resolved, not only so that justice exists, but so that Loan's family can have an answer after so long living between anguish and uncertainty. The UFO sighting of Trancas. The night of the 21st of October 1963, in the town of Villa de Trancas, Tucumán, began what would become one of the most documented and surprising UFO cases in Argentina. Everything started at the Santa Teresa farm, where the Moreno family was gathered. Jolie Moreno, 23 years old, and her sister Argentina, 28, had arrived from Rosario along with their young children to visit their parents, Antonio and Teresa, and also their older sister Yolanda. The sisters' husbands, who were army officers, were on military maneuvers and would pass through the area by train during the early morning. After an early dinner, Jolie was feeding one of her babies. However, near 9 at night, the 5-year-old domestic worker, Dora Guzman, entered the house excited. She claimed to have seen strange lights over the railroad embankment situated about 200 meters from the house. At first, the Moreno sisters did not give importance to the young girl's account. Yolanda thought it could be a bus circulating through the area, while Jolie and Argentina continued with their usual tasks. Given Dora's insistence, they finally went out to the patio to observe the horizon. What they saw there left them surprised. There were 5 sources of intense light. They were distributed in front of the farm, separated from each other by about 100 meters. 3 of them were right in front, while the other 2 were situated toward the northeast. These lights turned on and off intermittently, projecting powerful beams of light that illuminated the chicken coop and much of the property. In the gloom of the train tracks, the women saw a large elongated tube that emitted a compact and fluorescent light. Around that object, they noted the movement of some 40 silhouettes with human form that moved from one side to the other, as if they were carrying out some type of technical work or repair. The family's first theory was that it was a train accident or a crew of workers working on the tracks. However, fear began to take hold of them when they remembered that there had recently been some conflicts with rural guerrillas in the Tacaralo area, south of the province. They feared it was an act of sabotage against the military train their husbands were traveling on that same night. In the middle of that uncertainty, one of the sisters remembered having read news about flying saucers and suggested that perhaps those lights could be something from out of this world. Armed with courage, Jolie, Yolanda, and Dora decided to approach the gate to identify the intruders, even thinking it could be the truck of a farmhand. Upon arriving at a distance of 8 meters, a blinding light turned on suddenly, revealing what was really there. It was not any truck or any known vehicle. It was a metallic object, shaped like a disc at least 8 meters long by 3 high that hovered silently a few meters from the ground. Meanwhile, the young Dora, who was a few steps ahead, felt the glare burning her skin. Seized by panic, the women ran back to the house and locked themselves in along with the rest of the family, securing doors and windows. Upon checking on Dora, Argentina and Yolanda noticed that her face and arms were reddened, apparently by the radiation emitted by the object. Despite being indoors and with the doors closed, the family felt vulnerable. The powerful white beams of light from outside were so intense that they passed through the walls, the wooden crevices, and even seemed to sprout from the very floor of the house. The air was filled with a powerful smell of sulfur that made breathing difficult, and by that moment, the atmosphere was terrifying. The most disturbing thing was the drastic change in temperature, as in a few minutes they had gone from about 16 degrees Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius. The heat was truly suffocating. The children, although they remained in a deep and somewhat strange sleep, from which they did not wake up, were completely soaked in sweat. In a moment of astonishment and fear, Jolie Moreno decided to test the nature of those lights and extended her arm toward one of the beams that was entering the room. As soon as her skin touched the clarity of the light, that ray shrank and withdrew immediately, as if it had some type of sensitivity or intelligent control. While the mother of the sisters was praying and the others were shouting and running through the hallways trying to follow the movements outside, the farm animals presented a totally strange behavior. The 3 guard dogs, which normally reacted with fury to any stranger, were motionless and silent. The more than 100 chickens in the corral also did not emit any sound. The silence was almost absolute, if not for the constant hum of that object, a noise similar to that of a fluorescent tube or a machine turned on. Through the crevices, they observed that 2 of the lights focused fixedly on a rear shed, where they kept an old dirty tractor and other work tools. This situation lasted 40 minutes, and during all that time, the object closest to the house did not stop expelling a thick white vapor that accumulated on the ground, hiding the base of the craft, and making it impossible to determine if it was resting on the earth or suspended at a very low altitude. Finally, the object began to move slowly toward the east. The other 4 objects that were near the train tracks followed it. The Moreno family observed how the lights moved away into the darkness of the night, losing themselves definitely in the direction of the Medina Mountains, about 25 kilometers away. At dawn, the farmhand who drove the tractor discovered that the machine, which was previously covered in dirt and grease from daily work, was now completely clean, as if someone had washed it meticulously during the night. In the place where the main object had been suspended, a circular mark 8 meters in diameter remained, which was visible for years. In that sector, the grass was burned in such a way that for a long time nothing planted there managed to grow. In addition, scattered in a radius of 30 meters over a lot of peas, thousands of tiny white balls were found that melted to the touch, becoming a fine powder. The news spread quickly, and soon the Santa Teresa farm was filled with journalists and onlookers attracted by the family's account. The Tucumán police intervened immediately, guarding the place for several days to preserve the evidence. To try to clarify the origin of these materials, the help of Dr. Walter Tell of the Institute of Chemical Engineering of the National University of Tucumán was requested. After analyzing that strange white powder, the expert determined that it was calcium carbonate with an amazing purity level of 96%, mixed with traces of potassium carbonate. This physical evidence, added to the testimonies, turned the case into one of the most solid and respected in world ufology, being classified by investigators as an unassailable fact. The investigation revealed that the Moreno family was not the only one to witness strange phenomena that night. Although the closest neighbors did not see the object directly, some like Francisco Tropiano and the foreman Jose Acosta claimed to have seen the sky stained orange in the eastern area, near the Morenos' house. Dr. Renee Vera, who worked at the local hospital, was walking toward the town after her car suffered a breakdown, and near 11 at night, she saw a fleet of between 40 and 50 luminous bodies pass at low altitude. As she recounted, the environment became so impregnated with a strong smell of sulfur that she was about to lose consciousness in the middle of the road. Jolie Moreno, who with the passing of years became the only direct witness capable of recounting what happened, assured that NASA investigators approached her to study this case in depth. It is claimed that the details of this Tucumán experience served as direct inspiration for some scenes of the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind by Steven Spielberg. That night of 1963 not only changed the life of a family, but left an indelible mark on the history of Argentina's unsolved mysteries and also of the world. The mystery of El Loco de la Ruta. On the 1st of July 1996, passers-by found a body under a bridge on the side of Route 226 near Mar del Plata. It was the body of Adriana Jacqueline Fernandez, a 27-year-old Uruguayan woman who worked as an artisan and occasionally also engaged in prostitution. She was naked and had been strangled. At that moment, no one imagined that this finding would be just the beginning of one of the most strange and confusing criminal cases in the history of Argentina. Months later, another victim appeared, then another. Some were found abandoned near highways or vacant lots. Others simply disappeared and never returned to be seen. Little by little, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Many of the victims were sex workers. Several had been seen for the last time during the early morning, and in different cases, the bodies presented signs of extreme violence. One of the most disturbing murders occurred months later that same year, when the body of Maria Esther Amaro appeared mutilated on the side of the road. On her back, someone had carefully cut the word whore. Months later, near Route 88, parts of the body of another woman named Viviana Espindola appeared. Then came the case of Mariela Jimenez, whose corpse had also been found. By then, the fear began to spread through Mar del Plata. The press began to talk about a possible serial killer, and thus the name that would end up terrorizing an entire city was born. El Loco de la Ruta, the madman of the road. For years, the case occupied headlines throughout Argentina. News programs spoke of a man who traveled the highways during the night looking for vulnerable women, someone who kidnapped, murdered, and abandoned bodies near the routes without leaving any evidence. Some witnesses spoke of a bald and burly guy. Others mentioned suspicious trucks prowling the city's red light district. There were also those who claimed to have escaped similar attacks, Between 1,996 and 1,999, at least 14 cases, including murders and disappearances, were attributed to the Loco de la Ruta. Some victims were found naked, others were partially found, and several never appeared. The fear grew so much that even French investigators, FBI specialists, and even psychics participated. The police created a special division focused on serial homicides, and the city began to live under the feeling that a predator roamed the highways during the nights. But as the investigations progressed, a huge problem began to arise, since not all the cases fit perfectly with each other. Autopsies revealed important differences in some murders. Not all victims had been killed the same way. Not all presented the same injuries, and certain details seemed too different to be able to attribute them to a single person. That was when a darker theory began to appear, that perhaps the Loco de la Ruta had never existed. With the passage of time, different judicial investigations began to point to the possible existence of a corruption network formed between police, pimps, and people linked to the control of prostitution in Mar del Plata. Some sex workers reported that certain police officers charged them weekly money to let them work. Those who refused allegedly suffered threats or were directly victims of violence. Suddenly, this case stopped looking only like the story of a serial killer, and now there were also suspicions of cover-ups, corruption, and possible mafias involved. The then judge, Pedro Federico Hooft, even maintained publicly that, for him, the famous serial killer was largely a media invention that helped cover up different crimes committed by several people. According to this hypothesis, the myth of El Loco de la Ruta served to put multiple different murders within a single story and thus avoid the investigation of deeper connections. However, other investigators never agreed with this. The renowned criminologist Osvaldo Ruffo, one of the most important forensic experts in Argentina, was convinced that at least some of the first cases did show a clear seriality. The bodies abandoned near roads, the strangulations, the mutilations, and certain repetitive patterns seemed too specific to be a simple coincidence. This is what has kept this case as something so confusing, because while some investigators ensure that a serial killer does not exist, others remain convinced that the first crimes did have the same author. There is even the possibility that both things are true, that a real serial killer did exist, but that other completely different murders were taken advantage of to feed the myth and hide other criminal networks behind all the chaos. Over the years, there were suspects, arrests, and convictions for some murders related to prostitution, but it was never proven who the Loco de la Ruta really was or if he even existed. Even men like Celso Arrastia, a murderer convicted of killing women, came to be investigated as a possible culprit, although they were never able to link him or anyone else definitively to the whole series of crimes. So, to this day, no one knows with certainty if Mar del Plata really had a serial killer roaming the highways at night, or if El Loco de la Ruta was simply the myth created to cover up something even more disturbing, the abduction of Carlos Díaz. The case that closes this list occurred the dawn of the 5th of January 1975 in the port city of Bahia Blanca. Carlos Díaz, a 28-year-old young man who worked as a railroad worker for Argentine Railways in Ingeniero White, was finishing a long shift in an additional job as a waiter at a wedding held at the Naposta Club. Carlos began his walk home near 3 inches the morning. He stopped at the first block of Sarmiento Street to buy a freshly printed copy of the newspaper La Nueva Provincia, which he carefully stored in his work bag before continuing. Continuing on his path, he walked toward the bus stop located at the intersection of Colón Avenue and Estomba Street, where he boarded the bus of line 500 of the company La Unión at 3:30 inches the morning. The trip proceeded normally until about 3:50, when Carlos got off the vehicle in front of the railway machine shed a few meters from his home on Daniel de Solier Street. Upon getting off, he met 2 co-workers, who had also just finished their shift. The 3 men began to walk together, exchanging casual comments about an upcoming soccer match, without suspecting that they were about to witness an event that would mark their lives. While they were talking, a powerful white light appeared in the firmament. Initially, the 3 friends assumed that it was a plane or some conventional aircraft that was flying over the area. However, in an instant, the light moved at an impossible speed and descended directly upon them. Carlos, who was walking between his 2 companions, was suddenly enveloped by that light. Before the terrified gaze of his companions, an invisible force lifted him from the ground, sucking him upward. In a matter of seconds, Carlos disappeared from his friend's sight. Seized by panic, the two men ran frantically to Carlos's house to alert his wife, Mirta. They knocked on the window insistently, shouting that a flying saucer had taken her husband. Mirta, bewildered, could not understand anything. The idea that her husband had been snatched by a beam of light in the sky seemed like a sick joke or even a delusion. Minutes later, hundreds of kilometers away, exactly at 4:17 inches the morning in the Retiro neighborhood, in the federal capital, right in front of the imposing Mint building, the owner of a private house went out to his patio after hearing a noise and found a man completely hairless, plunged into a deep sleep on the ground. Next to him were the family's two dogs, known for being aggressive animals, but who on that occasion remained calm and silent. That man was Carlos, who still carried with him the bus ticket of line 500 that he had taken minutes before in Bahia Blanca, and also the copy of the newspaper La Nueva Provincia, dated that same day. The place where Carlos appeared is more than 600 kilometers from the site where he had disappeared, about 8 hours by road, and yet he had arrived there somehow in a few minutes. As if that were not enough, Carlos's wristwatch had stopped exactly at the moment the abduction occurred in Bahia Blanca. Disoriented and in a state of shock, he was taken by the owner of the house to police station number 46, where his account immediately alerted the commissioner. Given the magnitude of the story and the evidence presented, police authorities began contacts with federal forces and the government house itself. Shortly after, Carlos was transferred on an emergency basis to the railway hospital to begin a series of medical studies and a hospitalization that lasted for 17 days under strict observation. Carlos recounted that after being lifted by that light, he regained consciousness inside a spherical structure, a place where, in his own words, everything was round and he could not stand up, as he had no space. From that position, he saw how the landscape of his city and the sea moved away rapidly under his feet through a kind of square hatch, an opening that he identified as the place through which he had entered the craft. Inside that structure, Carlos found himself face to face with 3 green-colored beings. These creatures completely lacked hands, eyes, ears, and nose, and their legs ended abruptly at the height of the ankles, without possessing feet. They did not lean on the ground or walk, but moved by levitating softly through the interior space of the craft. Carlos described these beings as luminous entities that did not emit vocal sounds, since communication seemed to be carried out in a purely telepathic manner. Terror took hold of him, and he began to scream and cry, even getting to the point of wetting himself from fear in the face of the inexplicable nature of this situation. When trying to push them away, he managed to touch them with his hands, describing that the texture of their bodies was strangely spongy, very similar to foam rubber. The energy that emanated from these beings caused Carlos's hair to come off completely. The hairs on his head and his body remained stuck to the creatures, leaving him completely hairless. After about 19 or 20 minutes, Carlos was deposited in a delicate way and without suffering any physical injury from the fall in the patio of the house where he was found. During the 17 days, he remained hospitalized in the railway hospital. His case was analyzed by doctors and scientists. Clinical reports of the time registered physical findings that baffled specialists, especially the total and sudden lack of body hair on a large part of his body, as well as a strange mark in the abdomen area similar to a surgery scar. Although Carlos had never gone through an operating room in his life, even though exhaustive exams were carried out for fear of possible radioactive exposure, general medical results and psychiatric evaluations indicated that he was totally healthy and lucid. However, outside the hospital walls, the world would never be the same for him. The news of his disappearance and reappearance leaked quickly to the press, attracting journalists, even from other countries like Chile or Venezuela, who kept guard outside his house day and night. Media pressure and the constant questioning about his story ended up fracturing his personal and professional life. Carlos and his wife Mirta tried to keep calm, but after everything that had happened, they ended up divorcing. Overwhelmed by the exposure and seeking to protect his integrity, the man decided to disappear from public life. For 15 years, he lived practically in hiding, moving away from cameras and microphones while he moved from city to city, passing through Mendoza and Neuquén. Today, Carlos Díaz resides in Capilla del Monte, a town in the province of Córdoba, known worldwide for its link to strange space phenomena. There, he manages his own hostel and ensures that since that experience, his health experienced an inexplicable change, affirming with astonishment that he has not gotten sick again, not even with a small cold, in almost 5 decades. Although he continues to participate occasionally in international ufology congresses to narrate his experience, he maintains a quite humble stance, refusing to be called an expert on the subject and limiting himself to recounting everything he saw and felt on that occasion when a mysterious light lifted him to the heavens.